Thank you so much. We are continuing with our Jean Gebser series. We are not finishing up this section, but finishing up this sort of subsection of the numinosum, excuse me, mana and the plurality of souls. We left off on page 197 of this edition, so we'll finish this part, and then we'll get into actual symbolic representations of soul throughout myth and art and stuff like that. Now, I want to preemptively apologize. Normally, when I do these videos, or I should say, I apologize because I have a lot of allergies today. Unfortunately, I've been attacked by the allergy gods, and they're being mean. Now, normally when I do these videos, I like to rail like 10 lines of that sort of pure Colombian Charlie Sheen, and that's usually why I get so snuffly up here. But not today. Today I only did 5, and allergies carried me for the rest of the way. So we got a long video today. I was going to stop it at one point, but then I realized if I did that, the next video would be like 10 minutes. So we might as well just keep going. We start, let's just pick up where we left off, right? Let's get right into it. Quote, what, then, is the relationship of soul to spirit? Originally, a concept of spirit was no more in evidence than one for soul. The numinosum mana-like representations, in quotes, gradually gave rise to souls and spirits, not to the soul or the spirit. So very key distinction. It's not soul in opposition to spirit, it's soul in tandem to spirit. You'll see how these sort of work together. The first truly recognizable concept of the soul is the Greek psyche. The first notion of spirit, the Greek nous, N-O-U-S, of the pre-Socratics, and the logos of Heraclitus, which is also present in the Gospel of St. John. In its meaning of quote-unquote word, however, this logos has a breath character which reveals its psychic rather than quote-unquote spiritual derivation. The same is true of pneuma, which P-N-E-U-M-A, which shows clear evidence of a breath soul, its quote-unquote spiritual connotation, which has prompted Lysagang and others to think of it as spirit. Most likely was first acquired via the Hagion, or holy, of the New Testament. This in turn definitely shows mythical magic and even numinous, that is, predominantly dynamic characteristics. So when we get to the first understandings, or he says concept, so I'm going to use the word concept. Concept, of course, is mental stuff, but we'll say concept. It makes sense that it would come out of Greek psyche, because Greek was the pre-perspectival phase, but you can very clearly see how the unperspectival world is really running things. Even though we have concepts now, it's still just beginning. He continues, there is a clear significance which shines through this configuration if we think of the fact that at one point a single god emerged from the many gods. Parallel to this process of monotheization, which initiated dualism and the Trinity and reflected a centering of the ego, another process was underway. The soul emerged from the plurality of souls. Spirit emerged from spirits. The demon, the devil, emerged from demons, just as man, bearing his ego, emerged from men. So, of course, the individual is emerging from the collective. He's no longer just one of the men, or the men displayed in a I guess individualistic way. He is now a man separate from the men. Where'd I go? Man assimilates his Trinitarian form by attributing to himself a triune soul, as formulated by Plato, corresponding to the triune God, and conceiving of himself as being in 3 parts: body, soul, and spirit. So we'll see what happens here. This is what happened when we switched from the unperspectival world to the perspectival world. Excuse me. Remember, God emerged from gods, the plural. The singular emerged from the plural because it's mattering. Matching the pattern, of the consolidation of consciousness that is happening in man. So as the ego, as the mental structure consolidates, the ego, of course, being the sense of I, as that consolidates, we're going to see a strong sense of individualism. And that's what we're seeing here. Gods turn into God. It matches the consolidation of the ego in man. So we, in many ways, are projecting this individuality, this consolidation of the I, the individual itself, on to the world, onto it. And you see how this works with the Trinity. Remember, the symbol for the mental consciousness structure is the triangle. So we're seeing how that is manifest, both in terms of the soul, as formulated by Plato. We have the three parts, body, soul, and spirit, and there's the triune God, right? The Father, Son, and the Holy Ghost, or whatever it is. I'm not a Christian, I'm sorry. So it's very interesting to see how this is manifesting and working out. He says, is this paradoxical route to Trinitarian unity, parentheses, where plurality is suddenly less than singularity, since for mental man spirits are less than spirit, God's less than God, soul's less than soul, perhaps more than just a perspectival finite goal toward the self-discovery of the entity man? A man who can come to awareness of his essence only as an individual, and therefore projects everything else in terms of individuation, separation, and perspectivization. So exactly what's happening. Man is coming to a higher degree of understanding, an awareness, and an intimate awareness of himself, the individual, and in turn he's sort of projecting that on to the world here. And we can even now remember, this isn't done in a vacuum. This isn't done neutrally. This is coming off the backs of millions of years, or tens of thousands, or hundreds of thousands of the unperspectable world. So you can say, well, why, if he's being a rational individual all of a sudden, is he still taking the concept of the soul seriously? One, that's efficient rationality. The efficient rationality, if you watch my last Kill Rationalism video, we talked about how the soul kind of operates through the ego, which is very interesting. You think it would be antithetical, but it's not. That's efficient rationality. One, so it turns to deficient. That's the main point. Where the hell was I going with that? Hold on, what was I just saying? Oh, that's right. So all the questions, considerations, and ideas associated with the unperspectable world, they're still going to be taken seriously. And even if done from the new structure. So the mental structure is going to perceive what has already been sort of perceived before, but in a different way. So it's not this neutral thing where, oh, well, now you're being an individual, rational guy, so now you don't take the soul seriously at all. It's not that simple. It's not that neat. Okay. Individuation, separation, and perspectivation. What if there is another world, quote unquote, behind, or quote unquote before, behind, of course, being spatial and before being temporal? That's why he put it in quotes there. Don't get lost on the spatialization. Sometimes it's effective to deploy spatialization to help describe integral structure or spiritual stuff, just to kind of meet people where they are. As long as you are aware consciously that beyond, before, these are spatial temporal stuff, origin, it's above that. See what I just did? Okay. What if there is another world, quote unquote, behind or before this individually conquered world, a spatial world as much as a universe of space? Is there another world in weight, accessible only through individuation and its supersession? Just as individuation was brought about by surpassing the clan, so the individual comes about by surpassing the clan. Remember, man comes from men. In the unperspectable world, we have the unity of the magic, we have the tribalism. That's how it worked, and then that pretty much continued on with the mythical structure, though the tribalism consolidated. All of a sudden, we start getting the agricultural revolution. We get more people. There's less tribes individually, but there's now we start to see civilizations, which is its own form of tribe. It's just a larger tribe. And yes, technically, on Tuesday there were 60 tribes, and now on Wednesday there are 10. But having said that, there's more people who are engaging in the tribalism because there's more people, and all those 50 of those 60 tribes were subsumed into 10. Let's see. What if behind man, humanity, behind God, divinity, behind spirituality, were to become quote unquote attainable to man, or more exactly, become transparent to him to the degree that he could divest himself of individuality and cancel his exclusive and patriarchal ego confinement by freedom from the ego, just as mythical man abandoned the secure enclosure of the maternal, magic man the unity of the mere clan world. So what he's saying is you can transcend the mental consciousness structure, rationalism, rationality, the ego, and the psyche. There is a interior locus in here that is more powerful and deeper. Again, excuse my rational spatialization. And you can transcend the ego. That's integral consciousness. Being an individual is not the end point of history. You have to transcend that. You have to transcend the ego. Very important. Construed in this way, rational mental individuation would make quote unquote sense after all, a sense that would not only make sensible the mental structure, inherently sensible because of its directness, but also a sense capable of revealing the significance of the previous mutation. So when a new structure mutates, we can use it and its efficient nature to sort of examine the old structures, particularly the mental structure. One, we started getting history, which is good because it's really hard to do this without any sort of history. Two, this is what we do, right? We quantifiably measure and know things. So the mental structure, as much as I like to rip on rationalists, it's not the only thing. It's not a bad thing. It needed to progress. It is a good thing that it progressed. Just don't take it too far. If this process of projecting what is centered in man, that is, his triune individuality, were to be transformed into a retraction of this projection, so we retract all the projections associated with the mental consciousness structure, what does that tell you? That you are not the mental consciousness structure. There is a deeper you that is responsible for projecting and retracting the projections. That is soul, my friend, or at least it's an aspect of you that's more than just the ability to think rationally. Were to be transformed into a retraction of this projection, it would achieve a mutation that would reveal the quote-unquote divinitary and the quote-unquote humanitary. So instead of just going from clan to individual and then stopping, we're going from clan to individual to almost like a collective spiritual perception of the world that goes far beyond man and achieves humanity. Think of it like, I'm not going to try to seem more smarter than I am, but think of it like a Dostoevsky novel, like Crime and Punishment. The way I've heard it described is when Raskolnikov, or whatever his name is, kills the terrible barmaid or whatever she is. She's a terrible person, right? And I don't know if she deserved to be killed because I haven't read it, but she's a very just vile person. So it's not like you're killing some 6-year-old girl or something where it's just like completely evil. Nonetheless, he has to face the punishment of psychological guilt or whatever it is, the death pull of the soul, that is, because he has sinned against man, humanity. Humanity must be our identifying. We need to transcend the national stuff and do humanity. The problem is that only works when everyone does it. And then I don't want to make a rant about globalism, but it's easier said than done. Okay. Understood in this manner, would this projection then still remain quote unquote correct in the light of the increasing absurdity of its deficient and extreme ego hypertrophy, specialization, and sectorization? It is, or at least was, correct for the mental structure since correctness is there identical to rectitude and right-handedness, but this also implies a one-sidedness. The mental structure emphasizes only the one bright, right, conscious, masculine, active side, just as it accentuates one God, one soul, and the individual human being, culminating in the deficient, rational phase of the uomo singolare of the Renaissance. So, would this projection still remain correct? So, the projection of the mental conscious structure, the ego, all that stuff, it can give you correct things, but everything correct it gives you is going to be limited and it's going to be one-sided. It's very important to know that. That's kind of what my Kill Rationalism series is about. It just simply does not do well with anything outside the realm of quantifiably measurable and consciously known. And like I said, all the patriarchal stuff, the masculine, the one God, the one individual, whatever it is. Okay. To preclude any misunderstandings, let us emphasize here that potentially future mutational forms are present in all those phenomena which we today define in singular terms such as God, man, soul, spirit, devil. So that's kind of the point he was making earlier. All the singular aspects or just any phenomena in the world that we perceive with a particular consciousness structure, embedded within us is a different way of viewing things, a different way of bringing objects in the world into relation with each other, a different consciousness structure. So that's why he made that claim of, it's kind of true that nothing nothing's happened on Earth that hasn't happened before, but like you said, that's a superficial, shallow interpretation. It appears in a new way. The water to mythical man and magic man did not appear like simple water um, to the rational. This was soul to mythical man, so you had to be respected. This was magic to magical man. This is just a scientific thing that has properties and elements that keeps me alive. Okay. Their potentiality derives from the originary presence, which is quote unquote at work within them. So if you watch my last Kill Rationalism video, the origin, that's what he means originary. Origin does not mean time. Maybe he could have used a different word. I just have to make that clear. Origin has nothing to do with temporal beginning. It is a quantifiably immeasurable energy, power, force, whatever word you want to use, that permeates and is embedded in all phenomena in life. It is of a spiritual nature that is quote unquote above, if you'll excuse my rational spatialization, and embedded in us, both us and the world. It's the potentiality to view objects in accordance with the different structures. That's origin at work. That's that spiritual power at work. This unfolding is not just some random thing. Okay, it's of a spiritual nature. Remember the integral approach to history. Man is not the only directing agent of history. We are not the only ones who decide we connect A to B and B to C. Sometimes events can be so miraculous, if you'll excuse my religious language, or providential that they direct themselves towards us. And all we have to do is stop being too egotistical and rationalist and just acknowledge the obvious. This means that the true believer may be numinously touched by their efficacy, since he does not confront a rational, perspectivistic representation of quote-unquote God or its conceptualization, but instead turns to the numinous abundance of the name itself. From his irrational attitude, or more exactly, from his irrational sustenance, the believer participates in the abundance and forgets the strictures imposed on the word contents by intellectualization and perspectivization. But this is a matter for believers, and besides, participation is not yet integration. That's sort of that irrational religious belief and how that affects the numinous experience, or how the numinous experience affects that, I should say. We must now ask to what extent mana and soul might be equated. Representations that are associated from the very earliest times with mana point to a certain duality of the soul, for on the basis of the abundant ethnographic evidence, we are compelled to distinguish between a mana of the living and a mana of the dead, that is, between the life souls and the death souls. We have two manas, at least two manas, but when we're talking about soul and mana and we're trying to separate from the thicket, we have two manas. Just like the soul consists of two poles, we're constantly in movement between these two poles. The life pole of the soul, which affirms life, and the death pole of the soul, which denies life. Think Mephistopheles from Faust, think T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland, think something from Holderlin or Wordsworth for the life pole, and then Eliot and whatever for the death pole. Very important. The tension between these two poles is where the soul grows and is carried forward. Very important. Why in the world he decides to use the phrase certain duality of the soul, I have no idea. Duality, of course, that's mental consciousness structure stuff. What we're about to get into is polar complementarity. So why even use duality in the first place? Just when he says duality, ignore him right now. It's polar complementarity. I have no idea why he decided to use that word there. It's stupid. Let's see. In the representational world of primitives, quote unquote primitives, mana of the dead takes effect whenever the living encounter the dead in a dream, for example, or when the dead appear in recollections, but especially in the continuing presence of his name as heard, recalled, dreamt, and echoed. The mana of the dead man or his soul remains effective and thus lives on. So in the same way that, my Uncle Lee died, may he rest in peace, he was a great guy, I can still think of him, I can still recall him consciously up here. So if I were to do that back then, that would be mana of the dead. Do you understand? So when the magic man or the mythical man encounters, probably magic man most likely, the dead, either externally in an experiential sense or internally in dream or in recollection of thought, that to him is interpreted as mana, a supernatural spiritual power of the dead. Very interesting. This is an interesting little thing. Names in particular have an inherently strong numinous character Even today, a name can take the place of the actions and effectiveness of a person. We can act in someone's name, whoever he may be, quote, in the name of God, or, quote, in the name of the law. And here we might mention the probable kinship of the words numen, nomen, and name. Very interesting. This kind of reminded me, I've just thought about this right now, kind of like Voldemort. When you say Voldemort and you're like, oh, don't say that, don't say that. You're gonna stir up dark forces. That's kind of what it's like. So magical man, if Jerry dies, Jerry from the tribe, remember, everything they do is spell casting. You cannot simply just wander about and just cast spells and expect everything to work for you. It's never going to happen. That's not how the magical structure relates objects in the world to each other. If you missed that, go watch my magic structure video. So when you speak, that is spell casting. And when you speak a dead man's name, that's the death pull of the soul, even if they didn't really conceptually understand this. That has potential to stir up dark forces, and that will destroy you and your clan. Not good. Don't do that. And here we might mention the probable kinship. But life and death souls should not be considered to be an antithesis. So why would you use dualistic then, Gebser? Why? As is frequently done in rationalistic discussions. Originally, life and death are an entirety, a whole, that's magic structure, of course. In the earliest magic period, they unquestionably form an undifferentiated unity, and in the mythical age, they are complementary and mutually interpenetrating poles. Only in the mental conception are life and death opposites. See? Mental conception. We take the 2D flat circle, we have life and death, and we turn it to life or death. Welcome to transhumanism, people. But where an uneasiness about death or the dead intrudes and quote-unquote confronts early man as the quote-unquote completely other, we see that mana is not only power as traditionally defined, but also powerlessness. Mana of the living is power over life, indeed life itself, but it is powerlessness in the face of the mana of death. So let's read again. Or an uneasiness about death or the dead intrudes and confronts early man as the completely other, we see that mana is not only power as traditionally defined, but also powerlessness. So mana of the dead, of course, trumps your mana of the life, because mana of the dead ends things. Even man back then intuitively understood there is a life happening in me, and there is nothing happening in there. The person who has been consumed by mana of death is powerless. He could not prevent himself from dying because the mana power of the death soul, death mana, that's what it does. It's more powerful than the life mana, arguably. Undoubtedly, both magic and mythical man groped to find a resolution of this tension, and their endeavors brought about not only spell casting, but sorcery, mystical contemplation, and myth in the form of poetry. Remember my magic structure video. Man's response to the numinous encounter with the quote-unquote completely other was the attempt to subjugate it to his own power, his own mana. What did I write? Mana. I'm gonna reread that. But Mana of the Dead. Think about it's interesting that it comes from the moon. What is it? Day of the Dead? Is that what it is? Where the moon comes out and then the zombies rise from the graves. That's a really good representation of the death pull of the soul. Not only because it's exactly that, it's death in the form of these dark, dying zombies arising, coming to life. So we have the zombies who represent the death. They're obviously not going to represent the life pull of the soul. But what's happening here when the moon comes out here? The moon activates powers that bring to life the death pull of the soul sort of creatures, if you will, these zombies. And think about that. Death brings to life. Yin, yang. How could death possibly bring life? For the same reason that when you look at the yin and the yang, in the white half, there's a little black dot. In the black half, there's a little white dot. Death is in life. Life is in death. So it makes sense that you would birth the dead. Okay, it's not a contradiction. And it's the moon. The moon is that correspondence of the death pull of the soul, whereas the sun is the correspondence of the life pull or spirit of the soul. So very interesting image there. Okay. Man's response to this numinous encounter with the quote-unquote completely other was the attempt to subjugate it to his own power, his own mana. In this way, he attempted to compel the rainfall by his rain-making ritual, or animals of the hunt by his hunting spell, or to command the vital forces of his enemy, which too are mana and soul, to do his bidding, or to protect himself from the inimical mana with charms and defense rituals. Now, when it says, or to command the vital forces of his enemy, which too are mana and soul, to do his bidding, it's funny. It's not like a big headline, but I saw a headline just randomly scrolling, and it was these witches tried to curse Trump because they didn't like Trump. So they tried to curse him, and they were like, it doesn't work because he has a shield on him. So that's kind of what they're trying to do, right? Like they're trying to command the vital forces of their enemy. If their enemy's Trump, they're trying to command him. So interesting to think about that. I thought that was funny. Even early Greek drama, although emerging from myth, was still essentially a sacral rite, an attempt to force the completely other into man's own power and mana. Having established the quote-unquote antithesis between life and death soul, why even put antithesis in there, let alone in quotes? Just say complementarity. I don't get it. He says that later. It's so dumb. Between the life and death soul, ethnographers and others such as Smolenbach went on to inquire how quote-unquote primitives were able to bridge this dualism in such a way as to create the soul. This approach is one-sided, rationalistic, and consequently untenable, for it completely skirts the actual problem. For the primitive, for magic or mythical man, no such antithesis exists, and it is senseless to inquire into its resolution. So we're not going to do what the rationalists do and ruin historical analysis by taking all aspects of history and all these manifestations of all these different conscious structures and fitting it into their little rational box, bastardizing in the process, degrading it in the process, and not coming to an actual understanding of anything. You're not dealing with it on its own. There's nothing to reconcile. There was no antithesis in the first place. So why are you trying to rationally reconcile something that doesn't need to be? Don't reconcile the yin with the yang. For Magic Man, life and death formed a dark, somnolent unity. For Mythical Man, they were the polar intermingling and movement of dream image. Only for us, with our European mental orientation, are life and death antithetical. That's why we get death anxiety. That's why we get depression. That's why we get arguably midlife crisis, because you are worried about death. You don't see that death is already present in life, and now you're trying to conquer it, and now you're going to live out all your insane pathologies and ruin families. Whenever we inquire into the connection between life and death, we are already at the beginnings of the mental structure, where consciousness awakens to one-sided brightness, and brightness alone first takes on spatial significance. This mental consciousness, by means of its measuring propensities, places all darkness and thus death, and which at best is transfigured into brightness, into an opposition with its brightness. As Rode has shown, R-O-H-D-E, it is the death soul which mainly preoccupies the awakening Greeks in the late mythical period. So what's happened is we have life and death. Notice how I didn't say life or death. We have life and death. These are polar complements. They are the two poles of the soul. The rationalists have taken the two poles of the soul and they have said, no, we have life or death. These are dualistic antithesis. One negates the other. Now, like he said, remember, the mental consciousness structure is full, diurnal, waking, bright consciousness. That brightness is the same brightness found in the life pole of the soul. So it will always privilege the life pole of the soul. Unless you are Arthur Schopenhauer, it's always going to privilege life over death, right? Especially because it doesn't know what comes after death. Know being a very important word there. So, to opposition with brightness. That's right. So because you have now done one or the other, life or death, and you privilege life over death, death becomes something very important. But the problem is you're not dealing with it healthily. So death is something that is stuck in your consciousness, but it's not a healthy one. So if you have an unhealthy way of dealing with death, do you think that's going to manifest in destructive behaviors both individually and collectively? I think it will. I think it's partly responsible for a lot of our political problems. When you see, I'm not going to make this super political, but the far right calls the far left a death cult, and the far left calls the far right a death cult. So the far right calls the far left a death cult because they do things in the name of, let's say, fighting climate change, that essentially amount to, from their perspective, a destruction of life. I can't um, I can't drive my car. I can't watch my TV. I can't have any fun with my friends because that will hurt the environment. I can't do any of that. I have to walk or bike, and even then, there's going to be restrictions. It's just against the life pull of the soul. There's no freedom here. There's no meaning. There's no nothing. So they view them as essentially a death cult. And then the far left would just use the same logic, but the other way, right? They would say, no, you're a death cult because all that stuff you just mentioned is destroying the earth. And obviously, once the earth goes, we go. So you're the death cult. And I think that's a big problem subconsciously. And when you have an unhealthy way of dealing with death, I mean, obviously presuppose it's unhealthy. That's not desirable. That's going to manifest in unhealthy ways, and that's not going to be good. Let's see. Oh, and I also wrote Marcus Aurelius. So this is exactly what. Now, Marcus Aurelius, I actually wrote a Substack about um, the sort of importance and the beauty and the profundity of the meditations, which is so important to him because it's this perfect balance between mental consciousness structure and mythical consciousness. It is the perfect balance between those two. If you take it too far in either one of these ways, you're going to have a problem. If you take it too far in this way, it's going to be determinist nonsense and there's going to be no gods or any of that. If you take it too far this way, you're not going to be able to control your emotions. So there you go. And speaking of Aurelius, like that's what he is. That's what he does. All he does is talking about how his ego and his newly found rational thought can conquer death. The thought of death. That death needs to be mentally conquered is big. And that he does do that, but he also at times says, like, his conquering of death is just a reversion to the mythical way of viewing it, which is such a beautiful way that all these guys come out, they're like, oh, it's very powerful. I no longer fear death. Yeah, because you stop viewing it as this dualistic antithesis thing, and you finally viewed it as it is, a polar complement. And that confers psychic unity, which channels and compels you to do good in the world. Good. We got to move on. There's a lot of stuff. Not yet awakened to ego consciousness, man responds through magic. This is a good one. Through magic or myth to the intuitively sensed tension of life and death. Magic man, himself intertwined with life and death, links them together and thus establishes their unity. So life and death's magic man are one. They are whole. There's no difference between them at all. Mythical man, I like this one. Mythical man, enclosed by them, carefully preserves their equilibrium and submits to their inherent movement. Remember the 2D flat circle? That's life and death. We are enclosed. Inside the 2D flat circle is everything, whether it be the soul, me, the world, everything. The circle's been circumscribed, you see? And so the mythical man, just simply went with the coming and going, the flows of life and death. It didn't worry about death that much because it just understood that's stupid to do so. It submits to the inherent movement. There is a sort of quantifiably immeasurable cyclical force, and mythical man submits itself to it, not uses conscious ego to fight against it, to will against it. As long as man's mana attunement sustains the balance between life and death, life mana and death mana, life soul and death soul, and is not overwhelmed by them, he is not impelled toward a new mutation which increments consciousness and would transcend these forces and powers by virtue of a new capability, permitting man either to polarize mythically or to antithesize mentally the phenomenon by measuring. The overpowering dominance of rationalistic materialism today is compelling man toward a new structure and a new reality, as mythical man once impelled by the superabundance of psychic light and mana to a new mutation. Now, let's keep going. He says the association between the quote-unquote antithetical life soul and death soul for the quote-unquote primitives is supposed to have resulted from the sight of a dying person. I think I just realized this right now. I think he says antithetical because he's trying to speak to the audience at the time. I think he's trying to say, look, I'm using antithetical because you're using antithetical, but that's not what this is. So maybe that's what it is. Maybe I'll retract my criticism. We can well imagine how the immediate so the sight of dying, as you could probably imagine, was going to be a numinous experience for people, at least when it first happened. It caused, of course it was, because it was because there was a mana of the dead that accompanied the phenomena. We'll describe where that arises from. We can well imagine how the immediate experience of dying, the transition from breathing, pulsating life to rigor mortis, and the numinosity of an immobile facial expression can prompt an association between the life and death soul. So, of course, when I experience someone dying and the last breath leaves him, I sort of realize, even if it's non-rationally or not in an abstract sense, there's a tension here. These two are opposites, and they might even be dualistic. So there's a tension bubbling up, and that's where all the soul stuff comes from. In the transition that occurs in death, the quote-unquote same mana, or quote-unquote same soul, has obviously lost its numinous vital force, which was potent just moments before, while the other, the diminished yet quote-unquote heightened soul, gain in death an increased numinous power. So when the person dies, obviously the life pole of the soul that activates vitality, that acts as the sustenance of life for the human, when that goes, or it's kind of been overcome by the death pole of the soul, the death mana, and that has render the life soul powerless. Now you are rigor mortis, you are stale, you are frozen, and there's nothing you can do. The situation stated here in antithetical terms is, however, not an antithesis, but a self-complementary phenomenon. Yes, that's what I was saying. The rationalistic separation of this irrational matter is not to be taken as fact, but only as a working hypothesis. When investigating the death and life symbolism of the soul, we shall have to bear in mind that we are not considering a rational opposition, but rather attempting to retrace first one, then the other pole, in order to determine how the perpetual movement enables the one pole to flow ever anew into the other. So that's what we'll be doing next video. We'll be getting into the actual symbolism of the death pole and the life pole. However, before we turn to the symbolism of the polarity of life and death, we must first subject the concept of the numinosum to a brief concluding critique. The concept of the numinosum is not a very ancient notion like mana, but a true concept coined by our age for the purpose of comprehending a non-conceptual and irrational phenomena. So when you hear concept, of course, word association, mental structure, rationality, that's abstract conceptualization. That's different from imagination of the mythical and just pure holistic engagement with the magical. Now, insofar as the numinosum is defined as the quote-unquote completely other, it is not an antithesis. Yet as a third element, it already suggests more than an echo of trinitarity, and thus its dependence on mental thought. For this reason, we may well have misgivings that whatever it designates will take on mental overtones unless we take into account its conditionality. As a result, the concept formulated as the quote-unquote completely other already falls into the subject-object dichotomy of mental thought. The very formulation attests to this conditionality that divides the whole. Since a whole is always entire, a completely other is nonsensical. So remember, Magic Man is whole. There is nothing outside of it. It is whole. So if there is a completely other, it sort of presupposes that there is a part or whole outside of the whole. But if it's the whole, it would already integrate and include what is being considered. So the completely other, you can see, is the dualism here. It's this abstract sort of conceptualization. So it's sort of a brief critique of the concept. There cannot be such an quote-unquote other. Something is either a whole or a part, and only as a part can it be a quote-unquote completely other. So as a part, it can be completely other to the whole, but if it's whole, it will include the part and therefore not be completely other. This is not a play on words, but rather a quote taking it at its word, to show that the concept of the completely other is untenable. Let's see. If we were to approach the question of the numinosum from a religious standpoint, then the concept formulated by the theologian Rudolf Otto would be seen to include a supernatural divine power to which man in his belief subordinates himself. So there you go. It is a supernatural spiritual power that is so abundant and potent that it overrides any sort of mental intellectual thought, and man submits himself to it. If it's an object, remember we said in the last video, it is now rendered taboo. I have submitted myself to the taboo object because the object is just a symbol for the spiritual forces. You cannot mess with it. Not good. As long as we are concerned only with considering manifestations and the unfolding of soul, we will be unable to counter the possible objection of a theologian that power and mana are not just force or might manifest in the numinosum, but a power of divine rule. In order to shed light on the backgrounds of numinosum, we must remember that it was for good reason defined as a primordial experience. its experiential character places it within the magic realm. If we separate the magic, we separate the magic unity of vital experience from the one who experiences it, as is the custom today, then of course we can discover a dualism to the effect that, from the viewpoint of man, the numinosum is a primordial experience. But this discovery immediately elicits the logical question: what is the experience viewed from the standpoint of the numinosum? So we have the person, the numinosum, subject, object. That's mental rational nonsense. Is it a spontaneous release and manifestation of objective powers, or is it in fact nothing else than what we define in psychological terms as a psychic projection, the energizing of external objects, events, or actions by the dynamism or psychic energy inherent in man? Remember, Gebser was a student of Jung. He knows psychology very well. Perhaps we can come to a suitable answer if we examine two mutually illuminating considerations. The first is that the capacity for numinous experience loses its energizing intensity in proportion to the increment of consciousness. The greater man's ability for conscious awareness, the lesser is his experience of actions, events, and things as numinous. Early man and even children today experience a thunderstorm, for instance, as a numinosum, as an expression of the power of the quote-unquote completely other, but the rational knowledge of the physical condition of the storm divests it of any numinosity. So exactly that. Remember, numinous experience is that which overrides your mental conceptual understanding of it, and then a mana is sort of imparted to it. It sort of follows that if you do have a rational understanding of what is happening, a scientific understanding of what is happening, or even just a vaguely one, when a thunderstorm occurs, well, it's not exactly going to give you a numinous experience, but it's just a perfect example. Take the child. My nephew was very scared of thunderstorms when he was, 4 or 5 months old. I obviously wasn't crying. That's the difference there. Why was he crying and not me? He, being a 5-month-old, did not have the mental capacity yet to understand what was going on. I did, so it was nothing to me. I had to help him. So that's the numinous experience. It's exactly that, an experience, and you can understand it conceptually, but sometimes you want to be careful because numinous experience can really help you, and the more you try to rationally understand it, as the rationality goes up, the potency and power, the effect goes down. So that's how it works. But here we encounter a remarkable fact. As the possibility diminishes for numinous experiences from nature, there is a proportionate increase for such experiences from art as created by man. The emotional upheavals which can be evoked by, say, Mozart's Requiem, or by a poem of Hölderlin, or by a philosophical reflection, are most likely no less powerful than the original emotional response to a natural numinous experience. So if Magic Man, Mythical Man were having a bunch of numinous experiences with a dead body or a particular animal, we'll say that's nature, right? So nature was the one that conferred these experiences on us. But as our rational understanding of nature has gone up, of course, the numinous potency has gone down, but it has been replaced with art. So now art has the ability to catalyze this psychological energy or the energies of the soul. The art has the ability to catalyze the soul and all of its energy and whatever and simply change your life. So that is a numinous experience. And if you have, and it doesn't even have to be art, as you just said, a philosophical reflection that can be incredibly profound. It can be a little rationalist, but nonetheless, I mean, when I read this for the first time, it was a borderline numinous experience. I felt compelled to create this channel and do it. That's why I don't have any of the cameras or microphones or any of this. So I didn't even know I was going to start. I just did it. I had a borderline numinous experience. And since the basis for music is found in the magic structure, for poetry in the mythical, and for philosophy in the mental, all of them representing in a certain sense man's employment and mastery of these structures, man is thus able to elicit the numinous effect that resides primarily in the magic and mythical structures. Interesting. So, interesting. Music, of course, does not come from logical proofs or mental rational analysis. It comes from more pre-rational or irrational forces that are quantifiably immeasurable. And yet, if we were to live without music, that would suck. Life would suck. The result of our first consideration, then, is that numinous experiencing diminishes with the increasing awakening of consciousness, and that the numinosum is transposed from nature into art, or if you will, from the respective active structure into the particular reality expressed by man. The second point with regard to the numinosum has to do with the visual perception of early man. All ethnographers who have heretofore written about the numinosum or mana have not considered that early man saw in a different way and saw different things from those we do today, not only in numinous experiences, but in general. This is fascinating stuff. This is some fascinating stuff right here. So what we're about to get into is man saw differently. Obviously, he saw differently from us, as I explained earlier in the video. He's got a different structure that affects the way he views the mouse pad, so to speak, or the tree. But it's not just that. It's like a base physical biological seeing. It's different. It's interesting. He says the aura drawings clearly show that early man's visual perception took in at once more and less than ours. He perceived in any event an emanation, the energy and motion, and saw a portion of a person's mana. In this sense, his numinous experience is more realistic and more palpable than ours of a composition by Mozart, a poem of Hölderlin, or a statement by Leibniz. So here we go. Actually, I'm going to continue. The more realistic mode of perception of early man is expressed not only in the aura drawings, and it's interesting that he says the more realistic mode of perception. An examination of the Chinese colored prints from the 16th and 17th centuries reveals that, despite the clearly executed contours of the branches, blossoms, stones, and the like, they are suffused by a radiance which seems to emanate from them. So Magic Man literally saw the forces emanating from you. He saw the quantifiably measure. He was able to, in some sense, quantifiably measure the quantifiably immeasurable forces that radiate from us, both in terms of origin and the soul. That is aura, and we even see aura today. If you're a soccer fan, teams, fans of teams, what they'll do is, when the players come out and it's a pregame and they're singing the anthem or whatever it is, and the camera will come by and it'll just go from player to player and it'll show player to player. And if you got a really good team, if you got my team, Manchester City, or maybe Real Madrid or something, they'll say our aura is unmatched. And what that really means is all you're doing is looking at these guys, and these guys seem to be emanating a force that says they're going to kick my ass. They're going to beat me. So that's kind of aura. That's a more modern, so silly version, but it's kind of the same thing. It's that there's forces that emanate, and according to Gebser, and according to these it's not really Gebser, it's these drawings from back then. They saw the aura. Fascinating stuff. Let's see. They illustrate that even when still predominantly bound to myth, man sees the energy that emanates from objects. That is fascinating. In a very, again, I need to stress this, not in a symbolic sense, in a literal sense. And since everything that affects us is to a greater or lesser degree present within us, although our senses are limited, anything that affects us above or below these limitations will affect us numinously. So our senses have a certain range, and anything below or above this, that will be a numinous experience, my friend. Very interesting. Of course, the degree of our insight into these interconnections would proportionally reduce their numinous influence. We are now free to resume our deliberations at the point where we paused for our two digressions. These showed us the transposition of the numinous experience and the effect of our degree of conscious awareness on our susceptibility to numinous experience. Accordingly, we have had to inquire into the constitution of the numinous. I kind of skipped that a little bit, of the numinosum. Is it the spontaneous release of objective powers, or merely a projection of human psychic energy into objects, appearances, or actions which carry a psychic charge of this dynamism? Answering our question remains, however, a hazardous venture. If we consider the adaptable and versatile nature of the numinosum, and, because of this, its relative permanence, as in its transfer from thunderstorm to poem, as well as the dependence of numinous experience on our degree of consciousness and psychophysical constitution, our two findings might suggest the following. The numinosum, in psychological terms, is a projection. In psychic terms, it is an over or under stimulation of our capacity for resonance. So think about that for a second. The thunderstorm, I need to be very careful about how I phrase this. If the thunderstorm carries with it spiritual energies, that will be origin, not the spiritual energies of the numinosum. For that reason, I am able to hear the thunderstorm and not cry like my little 5-month-old nephew would do. That's a projection he made. So that if it really was that spiritual aspect, then it would affect both of us, not just one or the other. As long as we lack insight into the numinosum, it remains a correspondence between the inner and outer, between man and the world, the soul and power. Either man incorporates it or he subordinates himself to it. Very interesting. Yet to the extent that we have insight into this process, even where it over or under influences our capacity for resonance and places in doubt its temporal limits, the numinosum makes transparent inner and outer, man and the world, soul and power. And from this constellation, we see that the power immanent in us, the soul, and the power which resides in things, the numinosum, resolve and balance each other as complements at the same time that they engender a kind of mutual insight in a sense that reveals to us, indeed renders transparent, the basic structure and providence of the world. So because the numinous is always the object, it makes clear the subject-object distinction, but it is done in a polar complementary way. Complementary way, excuse me. It is done in a way that opens up an insight into how the soul operates. It's very similar to the soul, but the soul does the same, something different but the same. Let's see. So, like I said, the numinosum kind of gets you out of just here, or it gets you just out of here. It makes clear that there is both out there and in here, and there's a power that balances both of these. Now, of course, back then it's a psychological projection, but now we recognize, no, that power still exists. It's just soul. It's not a projection at all. The role of consciousness in this process is evident. Consciousness makes it possible to retract the projection that once took place. In more exact terms, the reintegration of the projection is itself an act of the awakening consciousness. So we're going to pick up on that. Thus, consciousness always has a reintegrative capability because it can reveal a lesser dimension structure whose events can be realized in us only through the directive ability gained from an additional dimension. Consciousness is therefore a function which reacts to the visible course of events in reality. So when a new structure mutates, you can use the efficient aspect to have a further understanding, at least to an extent, of the previous structures, as long as you do it properly, as long as you don't do what the rationalists do and take the life and death pole of the soul and view them as dualistic antitheses when they're really polar complements. As long as you don't do that, as long as you recognize the limitations of the structure you're using and then go back, you're going to be golden. We can therefore dispense here with several. This would be interesting for your philosophy, guys. We can therefore dispense here with several of the previously proposed definitions, notably the most rationalistic of them all, the Cartesian, Descartes, which equates consciousness with soul. Recent psychology, even psychoanalysis, has demonstrated that this equivalence is untenable. Consciousness has been equated with the contents of knowledge. In this sense, a historical or a moral consciousness and the like were posited on the assumption that the knowledge of historical or moral matters or values is tantamount to their actuality. So, according to the rationalist, knowledge, which is downstream from mental thought, rather than, mental knowledge. As you can see, it becomes consciousness. You can see the aspects of rationality kind of subsuming and taking over things where it doesn't belong, subsuming aspects of the world that are not conducive to it, and yet taking it over and not respecting it on its own. It's doing it to consciousness. So now the aspects of mental thought, rationality, are consciousness. No, that's ridiculous. Consciousness is more than mere knowledge, recognition, or cognitive faculty. So there you go. By its postulate of the quote-unquote unconscious as an antipode to consciousness, present-day psychology has perpetrated a falsification of primordial psychosomatic actualities. Such terminology and the consequent false structuration of phenomena is a classic example of the error which follows from a radical application of dualistic principles. There is no so-called unconscious. There is no so-called unconscious. There are only various modalities or intensities of consciousness: a one-dimensional magic, a two-dimensional mythical, a three-dimensional mental consciousness, and there will also be an integral four-dimensional consciousness of the whole. So The unconscious does not exist. Now, I will say, in 2025, I think we've done a pretty good job of recognizing that our ego and waking consciousness is not the only thing, and our unconscious, so to speak, does affect us. So I think this was a little more 1949 relevant. I think in 2025 we've actually done a little better job of this, but let's see what he has to say. This immanent four-dimensional consciousness is the original zero-dimensional consciousness as such, which is represented in man and in the transposition of its mutations in man. Real quick before I continue. So there's no unconscious. The unconscious should not be placed in rationalistic opposition to consciousness. Really, it's just the whole of consciousness, and whatever particular structure you may be using is the one in conscious awareness. But the ones behind it are just the structure's one dimension pushed back, and they are always active. So just always keep that in mind. The magic, mythical, mental, and now the integral are always going to be active. So when you say, well, I have the mental consciousness as my sort of the ego is using that to make sense of the world, or it could even be mythical or whatever it is. Yeah, that's nice, but don't trick yourself into thinking that the structure one dimension back is gone or just irrelevant or just disappear. That's never how it works. So this immanent four-dimensional consciousness is the original zero-dimensional consciousness as such, which is represented in man and in the transposition of its mutations in man. Just as breath is present before breathing, the thought is present before thinking, sight before seeing, being before entities, so is awareness present before the variously dimensioned modes of consciousness. Remember, everything is already embedded within us spiritually. We already have it in there. All we need is the unfolding of consciousness structures for us to actualize all that is latent within us. It is in unfolding. The purpose of the acorn to become a tree is pre-embedded within the acorn. Same thing with these structures. There is no question here of the quote-unquote unconscious. It is of interest to note that even today, the literature of psychology extensively identifies the unconscious with the quote-unquote repressed, the forgotten, and thus frequently devalues its own antithetic conceptualization. The unconscious, if one insists on using this misleading term at all, is the structure of consciousness one dimension less than a particular or given structure, and it is the next quote-unquote higher or incremented consciousness structure which makes the quote-unquote unconscious amenable to its mode of understanding. So we use the mental structure, we'll say, or maybe now the integral structure, to understand all other aspects, all other structures. That's healthy. That's not rationalist nonsense. That's not, I'm going to use this in opposition to this. I'm going to use rationality to negate my emotions and all this stuff. No, we don't do that. That's ridiculous. We take all of them, render them transparent, and integrate them into a balanced whole where we maintain the integrity of the balance, and in doing so, it will create something more than the sum of its parts. This is not to establish any kind of general oppositionality between the unconscious and the conscious, and even less to negate the conscious, but a way of indicating a unique aspect of consciousness itself, its differentiation because of the various mutations, and its various possibilities of manifestations and realization as determined by the respective or given set of dimensions. G.R. Heyer has given this fact additional meaning by his suggestive and pithy remark on the mythical frequency of consciousness. There you go. This is important for you philosophy guys. Tell me if you disagree with this. Consciousness is the ability to survey those interconnections which constitute us. It is a continuous act of integration and directing. Repeat for emphasis. Consciousness is the ability to survey those interconnections which constitute us. It is a continuous act of integration and directing. That is what consciousness is. Not being or thought or mental thought or rationality or knowledge. It is exactly what I just explained. He continues. And we must observe the fundamental point that there is more to consciousness than mere formal or reflective knowledge. Consciousness is not identical with the process of thinking, nor is it limited to awareness of the ego. Its illuminative function is definitely not restricted to spatialization and temporalization. It is not a mere counterpart of objects and appearances, rather It is an observant onlooker and an active agent with regulatory functions. Repeat, it is an observant onlooker and an active agent with regulatory functions. Beautiful. Since consciousness is subject to, parentheses, and co-initiator of, the mutations which seemingly transfer a pre-given originary presence to man, let's repeat for emphasis, since consciousness is subject to the mutations which seemingly transfer a pre-given originary presence to man, so the consciousness structures transfer these aspects of the originary presence to us. And now we use these structures to reify the world and come to knowledge of these aspects. It expresses with each new mutation that this presence of origin can be realized through man. There you go. Thus, consciousness does not depend only on the ego, but also on the itself, although it does not for this reason take on the nature of numinosity. So with these structures, we are consciously realizing a new aspect of origin. So it is not just man and his ego and his individualistic box who thinks that the world has no agency and there's nothing outside of our vision, what can be comprehended rationally or visually. It is the itself, that is to say, the origin, the spiritual ground, unimpeded or unmediated by the different structures, the different ways of relating objects in the world to each other. This is a good one too. Consciousness, because it is bound to both the ego and the itself, is the intensity capable of integrating the mutations in their entirety in man. Repeat for emphasis. Consciousness, because it is bound to both the ego and the itself, ego, sense of I up here, that's consciousness, right? But also the itself, like I just described, is the intensity capable of integrating the mutations in their entirety in man. This is what we're doing. It does not sound cringe, but we're expanding our consciousness in the sense of we are coming to knowledge of the different structures, and now we are integrating them. So our consciousness has been raised because our ability to survey those interconnections, which constitute us, the act of integrating and directing, has been able to take place in a healthy way. Beautiful. Only where consciousness itself has overcome its numinous and temporic conditionality is it able to avert the danger of dividing the whole into an antithesis or a division alien to it. Our way of perceiving the world depends entirely on the nature of our consciousness, for it establishes the boundaries and temporal limits of our world. So the mythical structure, its temporal limits and boundaries, then temporal limits would be the midday, midnight, right? The coming and going, the night and day, that's it. And then the spatial limitations and boundaries would be, remember the 2D flat circle, the closed cavern. So when I look up at the stars, that's like the ceiling on the roof of my room that I painted. Everything is, we are enclosed in an invisible cave, essentially. And then, of course, in the mental world, that's not true. We are enclosed by the material, objectified space. That is to say, the scientific world, the world of objectified space, of science, of materialism, of a scientific understanding of the universe. Our way of perceiving the world depends entirely on the nature of our consciousness, for it establishes the boundaries and temporal limits of our world. To the degree that we are able to integrate these boundaries and limits with the help of an intensification and not an expansion of consciousness, we presentiate the itself. This means at the same time that our entire constitution becomes proportionally transparent. So what that means is origin becomes consciously aware. It's rendered transparent and it has been funneled into conscious awareness. Beautiful. And not merely the quote-unquote part that is already manifest, which we have endeavored to make vivid by our exposition of the individual structures, but also the quote-unquote part that is still latent in us, which, together with the part already manifest, becomes accessible to integration. One of the preparations for this integration is that we withstand the power of the numinosum without rationalizing it. By this, we do not intend to foster any kind of hubris. We have emphasized again and again that everything depends on knowing, quote unquote, when to respond actively and when passively, when to let things happen and when to make them happen, while hearkening to the magic events, correlating to the mythical, and taking into account the mental. thus giving an appropriate degree of direction to these magical and mythical events. If we react in this way, it is possible for us to become aware of certain types of reaction that reveal how the one or the other structure in us predominates, ever threatening our integrality. That is, we become aware that we have our own specific emotional reaction to certain phenomena, reactions charged with a superabundance of psychic power or energy, and we become aware that the echo which returns to us will be appropriately, disproportionate, indeed of hyperproportions to our two violent reactions. So the longer you remain ignorant of the aspects of the structures and all that encompasses the structures, it's directly proportional to its intensity in messing things up. So if you do not have knowledge of the magic structure, its efficient and deficient use, and you start to get super emotional and super angry, the deficient nature of the magical structure, because it has not been healthily integrated, will echo back to you times 12, times 20, times 100. It's like that Marcus Aurelius line where he says, the effects of our anger are so much greater than the cause of our anger. Why? Because you have been a little rationalist or whatever it is, you or a mythical whatever, you have not properly respected and integrated all aspects of the human condition into a balanced whole. And when you can channel their healthy aspects and drop their deficient aspects while still remaining cognizant that they exist. So I'm a very flawed person. Now you have to understand I was a rationalist, so I definitely had emotional problems in terms of just kind of being disproportionate anytime someone would challenge me. It was all ego stuff. Now it's a lot easier to see now because I've learned and time and all that stuff. But you got to be careful. Just because you've read Gebser, I've read Gebser, that doesn't make me a flawless human being. I still get angry. I still get frustrated. I still act in a way that isn't necessarily ideal sometimes. Nonetheless, I am able to improve on these aspects because I know what's happening. I can just quick fire be like, no, that's deficient magic crap. That's not integral. I'm not going to do that. That's not integral. This is deficient magic. No, I'm not going to get angry and blow this guy's head off because he cut me off. Or I'm not going to get angry and freak out and start ranting because he cut me off in a highway. No, that's magical stuff. Getting too lost in the romance to the point where your life is just a complete wreck because you're not really dealing with the world as it is. You're dealing with this romanticized image in which you're broke, you're 100,000 in debt, maybe you're addicted to alcohol or something, you have no friends, you're narcissistic. That's mythical crap. You don't want to do that. That's nonsense. Then of course the rationalism, we already know that. This echo unleashed by incongruous, non-correspondent, or quote-unquote unheard of and inappropriate behavior is the striking back of the so-called strokes of fate, missteps, misfortunes, and the like, Even if only temporarily, such reactions and their echoes deflect us from our true direction. It is the balancing of such reactions by consciousness, our insight into the interconnections of vital and psychic potencies, immanent as well as extraneous to us, that is capable of establishing the equilibrium in which our life as a whole can sustain itself and stand the test, quote unquote, of truth. So that is what we need. We need knowledge and we need to balance these, not just know about these, but we need to actively balance them. And that's what we do with integral structure. So glad you guys found this. That sounded kind of arrogant, sorry. Let us now go on to observe those potencies which are represented by mana, souls and spirits, which become soul and spirit, in response to the centering of our ego. In so doing, we shall avoid two pitfalls. We will neither rationalize these events, nor will we permit ourselves to be irrationalized by them. Cognizant of the polar nature of the soul, we shall endeavor to obtain insight first into the one, then into the other pole. This will not be easy, since what is revealed to our quantifying reason in a symbolic imagistic form is not fixed in imagery, but rather in constant flux and movement in accord with its mythical nature. And, as in other instances, its unbounded spacelessness is an obstacle to the spatial predisposition of our understanding. So next week, we will be getting into definitely some non-rational stuff. It's I guess you could say it's irrational, but it's kind of irrational. But we're not going to be irrationalized by them, as Gebser says. So that was a long one. I hope you guys enjoyed this. Thank you guys so much. Like I said, next we'll be doing the soul's death pole, and then I imagine that'll probably be its own video, and then we'll do the soul's life pole. So I hope you guys learned something. A lot of this is informative, don't get me wrong, but we're still kind of setting ourselves up here, and but there's a lot of good stuff. So hopefully you guys have a little more respect for magical and mythical man, all those human beings back then. In a spiritual sense, I believe in reincarnation, so I think you were one of them, as was I back then. So as silly as they seem to us now, well, we used to be them, at least in my opinion. Hope you have a little new respect for the numinous and all these sort of manifestations. So I love you guys. Please check out my last Kill Rationalism video. It's about the power of poetry, and it's not as simple. It's not this simple rationalist. It just makes me feel good. It gets into the soul. It gets into origin. It gets into life pole, death pole. It's some pretty cool stuff, and I love you guys so much. I can't wait to see you guys soon. Thank you guys.